Transmissions from Hawaii is supported in part by Hawaii SHIP. Hawaii SHIP is a federally funded volunteer-based program administered by the Hawaii Department of Health Executive Office on Aging. Their Medicare-certified counselors provide free, unbiased local counseling to beneficiaries, their loved ones, caregivers, and soon-to-be retirees. They are recruiting multilingual volunteers to assist clients and translate brochures. Request a free consultation or join their winning team of volunteers on their website at hawaiiship.org. That's hawaiiship.org.
Transmissions from Hawaii.
Producer Tony Vega here, and welcome to Transmissions from Hawaii. Birds are an ever-present part of life in Hawaii, and I'm not just talking about those chickens running around outside many of our houses. Actually, birds are all over the place in Hawaii, and I recently learned that Hawaii has one of the most diverse populations of birds in the world. Unfortunately, many of these bird species are going extinct. I learned about this problem via a lecture hosted by the Hawaii State Public Library System. And the speaker that gave this lecture was someone who knows quite a bit about this topic.
So my name is Lindsay Young. I'm the Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation, and we are a nonprofit group based in Hawaii that focuses on conserving bird biodiversity in Hawaii and across the Pacific region.
Recently, I called up Dr. Young to learn more about her work, Hawaii's diverse bird population, and some of the efforts being undertaken to preserve it. So, could you tell me a little bit about the kinds of things you do? What your job is? Do you go out into the field? What do you? Is there, I guess, a combination of both? What kind of stuff constitutes your routine, I guess?
Yeah. So, in my role as executive director, a good portion of my job is at the administrative level. So, kind of conceptually coming up with projects for our organization to implement, searching out funding and partners to get those projects off the ground, and then all the way to the implementation part. So doing the actual applied on the ground work, participating in that, monitoring for the outcomes, and then writing up the results. So I kind of get to have my hands in a little bit of everything, which is something that I like. I guess if I were to break down my time, I'd say 2/3 to 75% of it is on in the office administration end, and then depending on sort of the time of year and what our project load is, the other 25 to 35% might be in the field actually doing the work. So I'm a practicing conservation biologist that happens to focus on birds, and I'm lucky to get to do a little bit of everything.
Nice. Yeah, it's good to get out of the office.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so could you give us an idea of what was like the bird population here in Hawaii like? Is it particularly unique? Do we have a lot of birds? What's the situation?
Yeah, so Hawaii is the most isolated island archipelago on Earth in terms of our distance from the mainland. And so this has led to the highest rates of endemicity. And what that means is that we have the highest number of species that are only found, or the highest proportion of species that are found in Hawaii and nowhere else on Earth compared to other island archipelagos. So even the Galapagos Islands, which are famous for their evolution, Hawaii has actually a higher rate of things that are native just to Hawaii and not found anywhere else. And so a lot of the things that we have here are really specialized and highly evolved to Hawaii's ecosystem and climate and suite of other species. And it also makes them really, really vulnerable. So as humans arrived in the islands 1,100 years ago and brought with them their pests and started clearing land and things like that, it resulted in a lot of extinctions of these endemic birds. And, today we're left with about a quarter of the bird species that were known to have evolved here based on the fossil record. So 3/4 of our endemic birds have actually already gone extinct. And of the ones that are left, about 3/4 of those that are left are endangered or critically endangered. So they're really not doing well. So we're the endemism capital of the world, and also, unfortunately, the extinction capital of the world.
Wow. Could you give maybe an example or two of some birds that have uniquely adapted to conditions here in Hawaii?
Sure. So it's a little hard to do without seeing a visual in front
Sure.
of you. But the sort of iconic Hawaiian forest bird is called the i'iwi, and it's this bright red bird with this long curved bill, and this beautiful hooked bill has evolved perfectly to go into the shape of one of our endemic flowers. Lobelia is the genus of the flowers. And so they have sort of a symbiotic relationship where these i'iwi get the nectar out of the lobelia, and they also pollinate them. So a lot of our plants evolved to have specific pollination routines with a corresponding species of birds. So a lot of them undergo what's called coevolution. The plant is evolving at the same time as the bird because they mutually benefit one another.
Okay. So what are some of the problems that are the bird population here is facing? What are some of the common issues?
So the two main issues facing our bird population, and we kind of broadly categorize them as forest birds, water birds, or seabirds. And forest birds might be the little things that you see up in a forest, up in a tree, kind of the classic birds most people are thinking of. Water birds are things like ducks and geese, our nene or Hawaiian goose. And then seabirds are anything that have webbed feet that kind of make a living on the ocean eating fish. So a lot of our Hawaiian seabirds that people might see are albatrosses or white terns. So of our three species of birds, the threats are a little bit different. The forest birds are, what is very critical to their persistence is eliminating avian malaria. So similar to human malaria, there's a bird version of it, and it's transmitted by mosquitoes, which are also not native. So getting our mosquito population under control and reducing the possibility of them transmitting disease is kind of the number one thing we can do to reduce the threat. Our water birds and seabirds are not as susceptible to disease as our forest birds, but what they are very susceptible to are invasive predators. And if you think of the Hawaiian archipelago, how far away it is, nothing could swim here. Nothing furry anyway. So cats, dogs, mongooses, rats, any of these mammals, anything with fur basically doesn't belong here. And so those are the primary threat to our water birds and seabirds, as well as our forest birds. So disease and invasive species are the top two. And if we got rid of those, we would probably actually have a pretty thriving endemic bird population here.
So what are, like, for example, like the example that you just gave of the forest,
i'iwi?
EEB, thank you. Sorry. So, for example, if that, I'm just kind of speculating, kind of trying to conclude from what the explanation that you gave, that, for example, if that bird were to go extinct, that could have an actual impact on, for example, the flower that you said that it evolved to feed from. I guess when one of these birds go extinct, it has, ramifications into the larger ecosystem, right?
Yep, correct. Because we have a relatively small number of species here. So the extinction of any one species, whether it's a plant or an insect or a bird, has cascading effects throughout the ecosystem and definitely impacts other species as well.
Okay, so then what specifically, so you said anything with fur, so we're thinking mammals, we're thinking mongoose, right? So what are there efforts being undertaken to try to solve this issue, or like what can be done? I mean, how do you get rid of, like, I mean, the mongoose is the persistent problem, right? It's like they brought mongoose to get rid of one problem. It's like, no, mongoose is the problem. So.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that were brought here were brought because they benefited humans in some way, or they're companion animals, or they're brought to control something else and it just went wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the short of it is, with all of the mammals here, we know precisely how to get rid of all of them. It's a matter of, one, scaling it up so that we can do it at a landscape level, two, funding, and three, political will. And I would say, depending on the species, it depends on what the number one barrier is. So cats, for instance, cats are extremely bad for our bird population, especially our ground nesting seabirds and water birds. We know how to get rid of cats quite easily, but there's a very vocal opposition to getting rid of cats because a lot of people enjoy them. And so we have cats as pets, but we need to do that responsibly and keep them indoors and not feed feral cat colonies that contribute to the decimation of our native plant and bird population. So that one would be a political will example. Another huge threat to all birds are rats. So rats will eat the large ground nesting seabirds and their chicks on the ground. They'll also climb up in the trees and eat the forest birds. And I think most people can get behind getting rid of rats. I mean, we do it around our houses all the time.
Yeah.
But in that case, being able to scale it up on a level that gets it done across a whole island is challenging. So we're not quite at the level to scale it. But all of these efforts, there is localized control going on in key areas of all mammalian predators. So we do predator control in targeted nesting areas to make sure that those birds are safe. And in some places, we've been able to build fences to actually exclude all those predators in the first place so that there are these small predator-free reserves.
What are some of these areas that you've seen or that you personally have been working in? What kind of things have you been doing?
Yeah, so in partnership with, landowners as well as fence construction builders, we have fenced 8 reserves now over the last 10 years, several on Oahu and several on the island of Kauai. And then if there are any remaining mammals in the inside, we remove them. And what we've seen from the results of those is spectacular. The birds not only, stop declining, but are actually thriving once we remove that predation threat. So creating these reserves, or in some cases, predator-free islands, like Oahu has a lot of offshore islands, getting rid of the rats and mice off of those islands has resulted in huge population gains. So it is possible to do things. We just have to overcome some of the initial barriers.
And then another problem you mentioned was mosquitoes, and that also seems to be related to, temperature and climate change. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for mosquitoes, they thrive in warmer weather. And so as climate warms up, it means that the higher elevation areas on our islands get warmer and warmer. And right now it's called a mosquito line. It's the elevation at which the temperature is too cold for mosquitoes to thrive. And it used to be at about 4,500 feet. And so if you think of the island of Oahu, we don't have anywhere that's higher than 4,500 feet. So the entire island of Oahu, mosquitoes can get to. And that's part of the reason why Oahu doesn't have as many forest birds as the other islands. Big Island, for instance, goes up to over 13,000 feet. So there's a decent amount of habitat left above the mosquito line. Same thing with Maui. But on the island of Kauai, where the situation is particularly dire, the top of the island is just about 5,000 feet. So there's very little left on that island. And as it warms up, mosquitoes are now getting into the very top into the last remaining habitat. And so we're essentially shrinking the disease-free zone on that island, and there's nowhere else the birds can go. On Big Island and Maui, they can still move up a little bit. And by moving up, we have to recognize this is not individuals saying like, oh, there are mosquitoes here, I better go. The birds aren't cognizant of that. What it means is that the populations at lower elevations are just extirpated. They're wiped out by mosquitoes, and so all that's left is what's going on at higher elevations. So Kauai, we're expecting extinctions there in the next 2 to 5 years as a result of this issue specifically. So we're expecting to lose species in the very near future as a result of diseases carried by mosquitoes.
Wow. What are some of the, it sounds like there's quite a few, but could you tell us a bit about some of the species that are most in danger at the moment? Could you give a couple examples?
Yeah, on the island of Kauai, it's the akakiki and akakee, and these are 2 very small endemic forest birds that are kind of yellowish green in color, and they eat a variety of things, insects off of leaves and things like that. And they're also vulnerable to rat predation. So in addition to disease being a huge issue, they're also being eaten by rats. And so they're very small, they're difficult to find, difficult to track, which makes it even harder to protect them because you don't always know when they're in an area. On the island of Maui, there's 2, the kiwikiu or Maui parrotbill, and then a ko'i or the crested honey creeper are also critically endangered and, projected to go extinct in the not too distant future, unfortunately.
Wow. can you think of any on Oahu?
Oahu, our birds are actually, they're holding steady, and that's because the birds that are left here have some demonstrated resistance to disease because there is disease at all levels.
Oh.
So our Amakihi and Apapane populations are actually doing relatively well just because they do have some disease resistance. Elapaio, which are the Oahu elapaio that's endemic to here, also has some level of disease resistance, but is very vulnerable to rat predation. And so long as rat control is going on a landscape scale, which it is, our organization does a lot of that, as does several other programs. As long as there's rat control going on, those species will persist. But that makes them what we call conservation reliant, where if we stop those interventions, if we stop the predator control, Oahu elapaio will also go extinct. So there's some species that we're able to keep going, but it's a lot of effort every year.
Sure. I'm curious. So it sounds like these specific species are native to quite possibly even certain areas within specific islands. Do we see a lot of like cross island like travel in some of these species, or do they mainly just stick to their one specific area?
No, for forest birds, they generally are found on a single island, and even then only in certain areas. So no, you're not going to see, a Kauai elapaio on a Oahu type of thing. They're very restricted, and that's why they evolved to be separate species. They're relatively sedentary. For seabirds and water birds, it's a different story. Those are somewhat migratory, so you might see birds between different islands. And that's also what makes them a little bit more resilient to disease, because they have some immunity from traveling and interacting with other populations of birds that might have disease in them.
Right. Okay. What are some things that the average person can do or keep in mind that can help in some way?
I think, if you're seeing articles come up on hearings or decisions that are being made, voice your support of those. We often get only the negative feedback of, I don't want this, but it's very difficult to get positive feedback. So hearing people say, hey, we want you to introduce some sort of mosquito control because that's beneficial for humans as well as the birds, would really be helpful. And then on a personal level, responsible pet ownership. So if you have a cat, which I do, that cat needs to remain indoors. And if you are participating in feeding a cat colony, that needs to stop. So cat colonies are a huge threat. So helping to reduce the number of cats on our landscape is a big thing that people can do.
Okay. And then and this is a little bit more of a personal note, but I'm wondering what got you interested in this specific area of research. Was there any specific, did you see a bird one day and you said, I want to know more about this? Like, how did you get into this?
I actually started doing biomedical research because I thought I wanted to go into medicine, and wasn't as much and always had an interest in animals. And what I liked from the biomedical research that I did was that it was very applied. So the research that I was doing was directly trying to solve a problem in a human health outcome. And I find that a lot of academic research can be a little esoteric and not necessarily solving problems that are on the ground. It doesn't say it's not interesting or worthwhile, but it doesn't result in a tangible outcome. So I wanted outcomes. And I had been really interested in albatross from the time I was young. I spent a lot of time on boats throughout the North Pacific and would see them trailing my boat. And so I thought, well, this is one species that, nests here in Hawaii that I can work on that will have implications for other species. So albatross are kind of my specialty. And then realize that there's so much more going on in terms of the needs and threats to all Hawaiian birds, that they share a lot of commonalities, and that an intervention that can help one species can really help the other.
Okay. So do you have a personal favorite species? The albatross, maybe?
Yeah, lace and albatross are my favorite. I'm biased.
So what do you like specifically about an albatross? What makes them special?
They're just really unique. They're not afraid of people, and so it makes them great to study because you can walk right up to them. But that also makes them really vulnerable, obviously, to cats and dogs and things that might want to eat them. But they're interesting to me because they're one of the few animals that truly spans both the land and the sea. So they spend 99% of their lives out at sea, and they come back to land only to breed. So they're really uniquely adapted to compared to really any other animal. And so figuring out what makes them, why they are, and how we can better protect them in both the marine and the terrestrial realm was interesting to me.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Are there any, I don't know, like bird watching kind of tips, like anything you can tell people that are like kind of curious to learn more about birds? Like, I don't know, look up. Like, I don't know, any ideas you got?
I mean, a great starting point for people that are in Honolulu specifically, we do have a native seabird that nests downtown on trees. They're called white terns. And if you go to whiteterns.org, you can find a nest map of all the different nests across the city. And so it's an easy way to see them. But just looking on various websites. So there's an Audubon Society here that can get people involved in excursions to go see birds. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has visitation to some of their refuges. Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources often have service visits into areas where there are native birds. And so checking with our state and federal agencies, as well as local nonprofits, will give you an idea of where you can see them.
To learn more about this topic, you can watch the lecture given by Dr. Lindsay Young for the Hawaii State Public Library System. You'll find the link in the show notes. And to learn more about Dr. Young's work, you can also visit pacificrimconservation.org. Transmissions from Hawaii is a production of Wasabi Magazine. It's produced in the beautiful city of Honolulu by me, Tony Vega. Thank you so much to everyone who has rated the show on Apple Podcasts. We really do appreciate that. And we would be extra happy if you leave us a review as well. Don't forget to follow and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use. And just a reminder, we are also on YouTube, so you can subscribe over to the channel if that's where you prefer to consume your audio content. So here's a quick note about the future of the show. We're going to be taking an indefinite hiatus. Honestly, I'm not quite sure when we will be back. That is due to a couple of things. Sadly, this show is just not financially viable at the moment. So for now, I'm going to be focusing on the Japanese language side of our company. So our company produced, two different publications. One is not being published at the moment. It's called Wasabi Magazine. We had to stop producing that when the pandemic started. And this podcast was essentially a spin-off of that magazine. However, the company also produces a Japanese language newspaper and website called Nikkan-san Hawaii, or Japanese Daily Sun is the English title. You can find the website over at nikkansan.net. That's nikkansan.net. So I'm going to be focusing on that side of the business. I'm going to be helping with a few different things. But if you enjoy this show and you want us to keep producing more episodes, then leave us a review. Let us know that you want more. And I would be happy to revisit this show if it seems like there's enough interest. I've absolutely loved getting to talk to all the people that I've gotten to talk to over the course of these 12 episodes that we've produced. It's been a wonderful experience producing the show and also getting to learn more about Hawaii. Now, if you want more audio content by me, well, you're in luck. I do produce 2 other podcasts that you can check out. They're both focused on Japan and the Japanese language, though. So the main show that I produce is called Japan Station. In that one, I interview interesting people with some connection to Japan. And I've also interviewed a couple of people from Hawaii, including Stan Sakai, the creator of Usagi Yojimbo, and David Nakayama, an artist for Marvel Comics, as well as many other fascinating people. There's over 90 episodes at the moment. There's also Ichimon Japan. That's another podcast focused on Japan. You can find all that stuff at japankyo.com, or you can just look it up on whatever podcast platform you use. So again, if you like what I did with this show, you might want to check out those other shows because it's me and I'm doing podcasts over there. So there's a decent chance you might enjoy that, especially if you have any interest in Japan. So to wrap things up, I'm not saying this is the end. We might be back. You got to let us know that you want more. And hopefully we can come back with this show being financially viable. But in the meantime, what I'm going to say is, from the bottom of my heart, mahalo for listening. And I hope to see you next time on Transmissions from Hawaii.